Hi, and welcome to episode 1 of the Booty Block blog. Do you need your booty bands? First, let me introduce myself. My name's Scott Hill, owner and designer of the Booty Block, a clinical sports physiotherapist, strength coach, physique coach, and a competitor in both powerlifting and bodybuilding myself. So, to delve into this first episode, we have to first look at some anatomy to understand the question of do we need booty bands. So let's take a look at the computer. So here, first we're going to cover glute medius. That's the one seen on the right. Here we're looking at the pelvis from the rear and then the pelvis from the side. As you can see, it's quite a small muscle group compared to the glute max on the left. But let's cover the anatomy of the glute medius and what it is supposed to do. So, let's cover glute medius first. Glute medius, what is its primary role? Its primary role is not to abduct the hip, which is to say out to the side. It is to stabilize the hip joint and the pelvis. So when you're in single leg stance, standing on one leg, its primary role is to stabilize the pelvis so you don't get any hip drop. And it also has actions that actually flex and internally rotate your leg and extend and externally rotate. So they work against each other to stabilize the hip joint. That is the primary role of the glute medius. Much like the rotator cuff R to the shoulder joint, the glute medius plays part of that role in your hip. Yes, its actual function in terms of insertion and origin is to abduct the hip. But that doesn't just mean out to the side. That can mean if you're standing on one leg and your hip drops down, its action is to pull it back up into alignment. That is still hip abduction and is actually when the glute medius fires its most. As we saw in the picture, it has relatively small muscle mass compared to the large, much larger glute max, which we'll get to later, because when we want to build a good bum, what do we want to do? Build the most muscle. And what does that? Glute max, but we'll get there later. And of course, this last point comes from clinical physiotherapy. When do we need to directly train the glute medius? When it's clinically weak. So when it's clinically weak, it's very easy to tell. You get a person to stand on one leg and literally they can't maintain it. Their hips drop off to the side. A strong glute medius in the normal context, not in the gym, they'll stand on one leg and they maintain that pelvic position. For sports people, we want to go one step further. Stand on one leg and then get them to do a small squat. If they can maintain their pelvic alignment standing on one leg doing a squat, or one-legged squat, they have enough strength in their glute medius to correctly execute the major lifts in the gym, which is primarily what's going to build your glutes. So in that respect, unless you have clinically weak glutes, as I've just shown, there is no point in isolating your glute medius for developing your glutes, because it's going to fire just the same if you apply good technique to the major lifts like squats, deadlifts, and all their variations in the gym. So that gets us one step closer to the answer to the question, do we need booty bands? And just as a side note, as this gets mixed up a lot in the normal fitness and gym world, and here it is, down the bottom, our special note with a smiley face. Just because it incurs a burn when you do an exercise, like the side-lying clams, which we give a lot in clinical physiotherapy for clinically weak glute mediuses, or let's say just bicep curling 1 kilo for 1,000 reps, you're going to get a large burn in the muscle. It is not causative of growth. They do not correlate to each other. As we know, the main correlation to growth is progressive overload in the gym. Now that's another whole topic to itself, but just because an exercise burns, let's say the booty band clams or sidewalks and all those things, just because it's burning doesn't mean it's making your glutes grow. Very important thing to know, but it also doesn't mean that it doesn't have any relevance in other contexts, which we can get to later. So the next thing we're going to have a look at, as we saw in the picture, we divert now to the big boy, glute max. What is the function of your glute maximus? Very simple. It is to extend your hip backwards and also torque your hips. Now I'm going to have to change this video in a second to show you what that means, because it is very, very important to the overall development of your glute max, which is going to give you the nice round bum, not the glute medius. And it is also very, very vital in your major lifts that you apply it through your squats and your deadlifts. So let me get to it. Okay, so here's our nameless model who's happy to stand here with his legs out. Now, what do we mean by external rotation at the hips or hip torque in relation to activating your glutes during the major lifts? Simply this: if you're standing relaxed, then we need to externally rotate the hips. So from a relaxed position, literally, you can see on its axis the knees are turning out. Now, if you simply place your hands on your bottom and want to try this at home, stand here, keep your knees locked out straight, and externally rotate and feel what happens to your glutes. They contract, and they contract very hard. So in comparison, you can also try a little bit of an abduction. You'll feel your glutes fire a little bit because that's the glute medius, which is a small muscle group. Now remember, external rotation fires up the glute maximus, the much bigger. And if you're doing the major lifts in the gym and some single leg work, concomitantly, it will drill your glute mediuses because they're doing their job of stabilizing the hips. And the second, of course, is hip extension. So either straight back or, of course, from a flexed position into extension. They're the main functions of the glute max. Now we'll let this model rest and get back to the tutorial. Okay, I'm back. So we have established that the glute max extends and externally rotates the hip, and what that means. That it's a very large muscle mass as compared to the glute medius. And this is a point I'd really like to make. It's just a misinterpretation of words, but if you're squatting or deadlifting and your knees are coming in and you need to bring your knees back out to track over your feet for good alignment, we do not want to achieve that by hip abduction, moving it out the side. We achieve it by creating hip torque, which then aligns the hip so the knees shoot over the knees naturally. So in relation to the hip, the femur is actually still just moving straight, but it's the glute maximus that holds it in that position. The glute medius is stabilizing the hip in that position. Very big point to make. So when we're squatting and your knees are coming in, typically, not always, but typically, it is not a primary function of a weak glute medius. It is tendency to have a lack of generation of torque in your hips, that external rotation, which will be another topic at another time. So what does all this mean? We've gone through what each muscle does. We know that the glute max is way bigger than your glute medius. We know that getting a burn in the muscle does not correlate directly to growth. Progressive overload does. So what does all of this mean when it comes to needing your booty band? Simple. If you do not have a weak glute medius with that test of standing on one leg, being able to squat and maintain pelvic alignment, and in your program you include some single leg major compound lifts like Bulgarian split squats, lunges, single leg stiff legged deadlifts, even heavy farmers walks, anywhere where you are putting the hip under load, maintaining pelvic alignment, the glute medius will be doing its action and getting worked far more than if you isolate the glute medius. The second is glute medius is very small. So if this pen was your whole gluteal muscle, and the purple bit was your glute medius, and the white bit was your glute maximus, and you wanted a big bum, where would you put the most effort? Into this with all the lateral band walks and the little sideways kicks on the cable and clams and all of those exercises? No, you would put it into the glute max because that's going to give you the most hypertrophy, which is hip extension whilst maintaining torque in your hips, which are all the things like squats, deadlifts, all their variations, hip thrusts, and any other hip extension movement that you can load significantly. So if the glute medius is working when we're doing all of those lifts, what do we use booty bands for? It's not to correct the knee out position either, because we now know that's about generating hip torque. Now, it's not to say that the proprioceptive feel of something around your knees is a good cue for the brain to try and torque the hips and push them out. But more times than not, all it teaches people to do is try and abduct whilst lifting, which is a very poor cue and actually doesn't fire up the glute max any more than anything else. So what do we use our booty bands for? Basically, they're good for warming up. So yes, you can do some lateral band walks, a bit of clams. If your hips are a bit stiff, of course, mobilize, warm up well, and you can use them in that respect. If you're clinically weak in your glute medius, then yes, you can start on some band work to isolate the glute medius and bring it up to speed a little. But as soon as it's decently strong with the isolation, you should move to single stance work. And here's a tip to have a go at. Stand on one leg, have you say your right foot, this foot's actually off the ground, holding onto a dumbbell, and literally can let your hip drop and then pull it up and down against the load, and you feel what happens in your glute medius. It will burn just the same as using the clams, which we know isn't correlated too much to growth, but it's also the main function of the glute medius. But if you're at that level where you can do that, you don't actually have to do that. You just have to do your main lifts in good form and include some single leg stance. And there is literally no real need for the booty bands beyond that. Except, of course, if you want to be trendy. Fitness industry, works on trends, and nothing particularly wrong with that. The booty bands actually do no harm. They don't cause major issues, but this video is just to show a little bit of anatomy and what they're actually useful for in a meaningful way. And then, but if your goal is to create large glutes or glute development, or it's a weak point in your lifting chain or whatever it might be, a little bit of knowledge on anatomy goes a long way. So we know we want to be putting huge amount of efforts into the glute max. And if you're not weak in the glute medius, it's going to come along for the ride anyway. So that is episode 1. Episode 2 will be coming out very shortly. And the whole purpose of these series is just to bring a little bit of science, biomechanics, and strength world into the fitness world. So finally, the purpose of this series, which will be ongoing, is to improve our results, get some science into what we're doing, and dispel some myths from some facts. Catch you soon.